All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our training this afternoon. Today, we are excited to have Disability Rights California here to talk about a basic overview of the Regional Center Self-Determination Program. First, for anyone who's new here, we want to briefly talk about what the FRC does here in San Mateo County. We serve families who have children with disabilities between the ages 0 to 22, and we are staffed by parents and caregivers of children and young adults with disabilities. We provide support, information, resources, and referrals to navigate the systems. We also offer online trainings, support groups, a resource binder, and a monthly newsletter. We are funded in part by the Department of Developmental Services, DDS, as well as the California Department of Education under the Special Education Division. I want to give a disclaimer that the FRC is not a legal firm or legal services agency, and we cannot provide any legal advice. Any information provided by us should not be considered a means of taking the place of legal advice that must be obtained through an attorney. With that, we invite you all to connect with us, and we'll put our contact information in the chat. I also want to introduce our FRC team. My name is Iris Wen, and I'm the FRC Training Coordinator. And here with me is Patricia Idrugo, FRC Supervisor. Next, we just want to go over some general housekeeping items to make sure this training runs smoothly. We will be recording this training to make available on our FRC video library. So we ask that you please mute yourself when not speaking to avoid any background noise, and please be respectful throughout this training. We are offering simultaneous interpretation in Spanish today. So if you haven't already, please select the language that you would like to listen to this presentation in. You can do so in the settings bar under the globe icon and select either English or Spanish. We ask that if you're listening in English, please still select English in the settings bar, and this will allow you to hear the interpreters translate from Spanish to English if needed. We are also offering live automated captions today. So if you'd like to view the captions, you can go to your Zoom settings bar, find the CC icon, and click to show captions. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. Please save your questions for the end, as we'll be pausing the recording for questions. During this time, you can feel free to come off mute, use the raise hand feature or the chat box for questions and comments. During this time, we ask that you please don't share any detailed information, and please keep your questions general to protect your privacy and time of all of the participants. We have a pretty large group today, so we want to make sure that everyone has a chance to have their questions answered. If you have a more complicated question or situation, you're always welcome to connect with the FRC team or Disability Rights for one-on-one support. After this training, we will be sending out 2 surveys, one for us, the FRC, and one for Disability Rights California, to collect your feedback on how the training went. The surveys are anonymous, let us know how to improve our trainings, and most importantly, allow us to continue providing these trainings for you all. And last, we will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with all of the materials from this training. And now I'll turn it over to Disability Rights. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Iris, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of our team, Maria Rarty, our senior attorney, Emily Kuta, our staff attorney, and myself, Lonnie Pfeiffer, we welcome you. Today we will talk about self-determination, basic information to provide to you and the families and individuals that attended today. As Iris mentioned, we ask that you don't put anything private in the chat when you ask your questions. Please keep it as general as you can. If you need additional assistance on your particular matter, our 1-800 number is on the chat. You can certainly reach out to us, and somebody from our organization will reach back out to you. For those who don't know about us, I'll just share a little bit about our agency and the services we offer, and then I'll turn it over to our team. We were formerly known as Protection and Advocacy, PAI. We are a nonprofit organization founded in 1978. We are federally mandated to provide legal services for people with disabilities. The issues we work on can be anything from special education, regional center services, public benefits, housing, employment rights, and so many others. We have offices in Sacramento, Los Angeles, Bay Area, and San Diego. And then our smaller offices are located in Fresno, Ontario, and Modesto. So thank you, everyone. I'll go ahead and turn it over to our team.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to put the PowerPoints up. And as we've mentioned before, this is a very basic training on self-determination. If you have more sophisticated issues, we invite you to call us. Like any new program, there are hiccups along the way. And I think at the end of the presentation, we have a resource section where we include an organization called Disability Voices United. They have calls where people join to talk about issues involving self-determination. And so I invite you to explore Disability Voices United. So we're going to talk about the self-determination program today. Next slide, please. So in order to talk about self-determination, I need to just mention briefly the traditional system of obtaining services through the regional center. Let's say I'm a consumer of the regional center and I want services. I meet with my service coordinator. We talk about my needs, my goals, put together an IPP where the regional center agrees to provide me with certain services. I don't have to deal with anything other than agreeing to sign the IPP, of course, making sure I get the services, but that's it. I don't have to deal with a spending plan. I don't have to deal with the budget, and so forth. The self-determination program is a program that where participants are given a budget from which they can purchase services and supports that they need for their IPP. The IPP, individual program plan, is the contract between the regional center and the consumer. And so what services and supports are in the IPP are things that need to be provided to the consumer. One thing I just want to mention briefly is sometimes we hear consumers saying to us, well, yes, the services are in the IPP, but our regional center saying that they don't have any vendors. Well, that's not an excuse because there are things that can happen. Because remember, that contract is that IPP is a contract and it needs to be honored. And if the regional center is not providing the services in the IPP, then you can file what is called a 4731 complaint. So back to self-determination, it gives consumers more control in developing their service plans and selecting the providers. The plan, what's the plan for? To make sure that the consumer is living the life that he or she wants to live, right? Now, the Department of Developmental Services oversees the whole regional center system. And of course, consumers are dealing with regional centers. You apply to regional centers for eligibility. And once you're a consumer, you're going to be dealing with a service coordinator assigned to you moving forward. Next slide. Okay, so the self-determination program was a pilot program from 1998 to 2001. 200 consumers were selected to be involved in this pilot program. The feedback was positive, including more freedom and responsibility in choosing service providers and handling their own budget. So in July of 2021, the program became available to all regional center consumers. And it's voluntary. You don't have to be in the self-determination program if you don't want to. Next slide. So the 5 principles of self-determination, you decide how you want to live your life. You have authority over your budget so that you can purchase the services and supports you want to meet your goals. Um, you're going to have support if you want, to organize services and staffing, responsibility. You're going to be, you're going to be responsible in the SDP program for using your money wisely, or the money in your budget. And confirmation, your role under this program in making decisions and overseeing the service you need. Next slide. Okay. To participate in the self-determination program, obviously you have to be a regional center consumer, not living in a licensed facility. But guess what? If you're in a licensed facility and you want to move out and into the community, the regional center can you can request the plan to be, to be in the self-determination program. You're going to have to attend an orientation training. These orientation trainings on the self-determination program are provided through the regional centers. So we have a link here for an example of how to register for the self-determination program orientation for the Regional Center of Orange County. You can go to that link, but all regional centers should have this on their websites. You can also attend the orientation through the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, and the link to sign up is right there. Next slide. Okay, so in the orientation, you're going to learn about person-centered planning, what it means by individual budgets, the spending plan, how to arrange services, and using the financial management services. We're going to talk about these things as we move on. Next slide. So I'm now going to hand this over to Emily, who's going to talk about the person-centered plan.
Hi, everyone. And before I go any further, we just want to clarify again that this is a very broad, very general overview about the self-determination program. So, for example, the orientation that you are required to take is significantly longer and more detailed and gets into the level of specificity that this presentation we are not able to, but this is to help give you an idea of what this program is, and also as you get a better idea and a better understanding whether you want to go with this type of system as an alternative to the traditional regional center model. So I'm just going to go over like the main most essential components of that make the self-determination program work. And one of them is the person-centered plan, or PCP for short. And there's going to be a lot of acronyms, so just to do heads up. So what is this person-centered plan? The person-centered plan, it is an overview where the focus is on what is your future and how do you reach that future by setting up goals and objectives. You are the one who leads this PCP process with your chosen circle of support. And what I mean by you, what we mean by you, that the phrase in this presentation is that we're referring to the actual client of the regional center, the person who is getting and eligible for services from the regional center. So we really want to emphasize that that is the person who is that it's their desires, their interests, their dreams that is guiding this process, but that also can include the circle of support, family, friends, other people. So we just want to emphasize that. The PCP should reflect what is important to you. And as I said, it can include other people, family or friends, and you can choose to include them and others in that process. It's completely up to you. Once you have made your choices about what you want and need, then an IPP is written based on your decisions. So if you're thinking, wait, what's the difference between a PCP and an IPP? They're both the PCP informs the IPP. They are technically separate, but the IPP is still going to be a crucial part of this process. The difference is that the IPP kind of looks a bit more narrowly, and also to 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 try to describe it, pretty much often goes from the perspective of, okay, where are the areas that you need to improve? What are your weaknesses? What are the biggest problems? And what kind of goals do you need to fix those problems or improve? And that kind of perspective can be problematic. So what the difference was with this PCP in this self-determination program was, let's look at what you want. What are your strengths? What are your interests? What do you want out of life? Not just now, but in the long term. And how can we incorporate that and use that to inform the IPP? So those are the ways that is become part of this SDP process. So the services are no longer provided based on what you are not good at. The IPP lays out your goals and what is needed to reach those goals, including necessary services and supports, but with the longer term focus being informed by the PCP of what do you want down the line? What are your dreams, your interests, your future? Do you want to have a job someday? Do you want to live on your own someday? Do you want to participate in these activities in the community? That's where the PCP can really be useful coming into that. What should I expect from the PCP? Pretty much a written plan that is consistent with what you want, what you need, your goals. Includes your preferences in areas like recreation, transportation, friendship, therapies, home, jobs, family relationships. So it really looks broadly. No, it's not just about like it's not just about like where you live and where you work. It looks like all aspects that you want to engage in. The plan should have clearly stated outcomes that include your strengths, your hopes, and the supports needed to have a meaningful life in the community. And the goals must not be restricted because of a lack of easily identified services or supports, like Maria mentioned. If right now a specific provider or service can't be put into place or identified, not a reason why it can't be written into the PCP. And just want to emphasize the benefit of having an independent facilitator to support and advocate for you at the PCP. And we're going to go more into detail about what an independent facilitator is and what their role is. So there's a lot of info here. I just want to emphasize that this is really just giving you some context and background about some recent changes specifically to the funding of supports for PCP. There's been quite a few directives, basically orders from the state agency, DDS, about in what ways families can utilize certain services to help them with this whole person-centered planning process. And I don't want you to get too lost in the weeds, just letting you know that there have been some recent changes. So just in case, like if you're looking this up yourself, the information may be outdated. And so it helps to know like what the most recent developments have been. So there's a DDS guidance on options for self-directed supports. And I also just wanted to reference these service codes. Again, you don't have to really get into the nitty gritty, just letting you know here are some background info that might be relevant if you are planning to get deeper into this at orientation and want to ask follow-up questions. So up until now, basically, regional centers provided what was called, as described, an option A. Basically, let's say you wanted to choose a independent professional to act as your independent facilitator. And again, I'll go into more detail about what IFs do, but in short, IFs really help to advocate for you, set into place, not just drafting and formulating the PCP, but actually getting advocating for enough funding for you to get those services. And there was an option where if you were choosing the service, if you were one to obtain and basically hire someone to act as an IF, you had the option of getting the regional center to pay them up to a certain amount for their services and creating this PCP. So that option was regional centers may pay up to $22,500 for transition supports and person-centered planning, and they would reimburse the independent facilitator to help you get that PCP off the ground. I say up to 2,500. It could, like for example, it could be like 1,500, and then the extra like $1,000 you can get the regional center to pay for like other follow-up post PCP services. So that was one option. Like, okay, independent facilitator, we can get you up to $2,500 reimbursed by the regional center for you to help us set up a good PCP. But now that's pretty much expired, ending December 31st, 2024. So right before the 2025 new year. And now there's option B, effective February. Oh, sorry, I completely got the date wrong. 2025. So I have to reminder, go back, update that. Effective February 2025, regional centers may pay up to $1,000 for the initial PCP. So now it's up to 1,000, not 2,500, to where the regional center can reimburse your IF. But you're like, oh, well, that's not too great. It's less now. But now they may authorize up to 40 hours of self-directed supports. So your IF could also, on top of that 1,000, be reimbursed to provide these hours of self-directed supports. And I put an example of like straight from a regional center webpage where they go into it, describing like, okay, this is how we're going to set it up. So I'll just read it out. North Los Angeles County Regional Center may purchase and make payment up to $1,000 for the initial PCP created by a self-directed supports provider, which could be the IF. Separately, the 099 service, again, that's the service code, don't get too caught up in that, is funded at an hourly rate as established by DDS. The current rate of reimbursement is $50 about per hour. Regional centers may authorize payment for up to 40 hours. So in short, what this all means is this is just this is what is set up now to how you can pay back your independent facilitator, getting the funds from the regional center. First it was option A, now it's option B. And a reminder again, I have to go back and fix that date, 2025. I put the link to that example. And if you want to do a little more reading, I actually posted a link to the DDS directive itself where they explain this change from option A to option B. DDS actually even did a presentation because yeah, a lot of people were like, whoa, we just learned about option A. Now we have to go with option B. So they actually did a whole presentation explaining it. I put the link to that as well.
Okay, we're going to talk more about the independent facilitator. Thank you, Emily. So these directives, what's interesting about the directives, and we're going to take you at the end of the presentation to the DDS website where you can find a lot of information on self-determination. There is a section there just for directives on the self-determination program, which I thought was pretty neat because usually the directives are not separated by subject. It's just by date. But all of these self-determination directives are together, which is kind of nice. So let's talk about the independent facilitator. Next slide, please. Okay. You can choose, as a consumer, you can choose someone to help you, called the independent facilitator. You don't have to have an independent facilitator. So what can these independent facilitators help the consumers with? To make informed decisions about the budget, to locate, access, and coordinate services and supports that are in your IPP, to identify immediate and long-term needs and how we're going to meet those needs, to advocate on your behalf, like Emily said, in the person-centered planning process and developing the IPP, obtain and identify supports and services. So there's a lot that the independent facilitator can do. If you don't want to have an independent facilitator, then this is the kind of stuff that you're going to be dealing with on your own. Next slide. You can have one or more independent facilitators, but note that IFs will be paid from your spending plan. And you're going to have to negotiate between the IF and you as to how much you're going to pay your independent facilitator out of your budget. So if the regional center agrees, let's say on, I'm just going to pick a number, $50,000 budget. Well, if you're going to have an independent facilitator, it's going to be paid out of that $50,000 budget. And the budget will not be increased. So if the regional center agrees to a $50,000 budget, it's not going to be increased just because you now have an independent facilitator. Now, parents of adult children can be independent facilitators, but parents of minor children cannot be independent facilitators. You can choose to have the regional center service coordinator be your independent facilitator too. Next slide. So independent facilitators are not required to have a certificate or a license, but they're required to get training in principles of self-determination, the person-centered planning, their responsibilities in the process. Now, also, independent facilitators cannot provide the services that are in your IPP. Okay, so if I'm an independent facilitator and I cannot provide the service, and I'm your independent facilitator, I cannot provide the services in your IPP. And the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, we gave you the link to SCDD, but you can go to their main web page. They also provide training to independent facilitators. Next slide. Okay, so let's now talk about service providers. So in the traditional system, generally speaking, you have to use someone who's vendored with the regional center, who has a contract with the regional center to provide the service. Now, in self-determination, you don't have to do that. You don't have to go with vendored providers. In fact, you can choose family members to provide certain services, and you can go with people who don't have contracts with the regional center. Next slide. Now, service providers will be required to undergo a criminal background check if they're going to provide direct personal care services like cleaning, grooming, bathing, feeding, those kinds of things. Also, if the financial management service, and we're going to talk about financial management service agencies later. If they request a background check, then the service provider has to undergo a background check. Now, if there's an applicant or who wants to be a service provider who has a violation or conviction in their record, and they want to be a service provider, of course, they have to request an exemption from DDS to obtain clearance. And the service providers or their employing agencies are responsible for the cost of the background check. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Emily, who's going to talk about the financial management services.
Before I get into FMS, so I realize, sorry to create any confusion, I didn't make a typo. Turns out it was 2023. I just got confused, or I got mixed up the end of the option A with the start of option B. Turned out option A has ended starting January 2025, but option B did start already starting in 2023. You could just choose either one. But now you can only go with option B, which is the $1,000 and up to 40 hours of self-directed supports, reimbursable by the regional center to your IF. So my correction to my correction. Okay, so back on track, going into the financial management service, FMS, and what is its role and why it's important as the only required service provider in this whole SDP process. So an FMS actually is the service provider that helps you to manage your individual budget. Individual budgets, we're going to go more into what that is, but in short, it's basically the money's that's combined to help pay for services, and it's paid for by the regional center. And so if you're thinking, who's the one actually going through and making sure the money from that budget is getting and paying off these different people and vendors? FMS. That is exactly what they do. The FMS will help you pay bills and employees. The FMS pays service providers directly. The FMS may require service providers to show that they are qualified to deliver services. That FMS may require service providers to undergo background checks. The FMSs are the only, like I said, they're the only ones that must be vendored with the regional center. So you remember that whole that point that Maria mentioned of like you could choose any person to provide services. You want someone to you want to go with a person who can help provide social recreation like swim instruction. You don't have to go, it's like, oh, you have to go through the whole vendorization and contract with the regional center. Not with SDP, you could choose anyone. But if you're thinking, oh, can I just not go with this FMS agency? No, the FMS is the only one where they actually have to have already set up a contract, a relationship with the regional center. They're the only one though. So you could still choose whoever you want to provide like respite provider, social rec, but you gotta have an FMS working with the regional center who can help manage your budget. So that's what we mean that the only required vendored service provider with the regional center. The FMS will use the funds in your individual budget to pay for the services in your IPP. And you are required, and basically saying what I already said, you are required to use the services of an SMS, but you can choose the FMS. So if you're thinking, no, I would rather not go through an FMS. Sorry, you have to go through an FMS. So you're thinking, the one question is, okay, well, who pays the FMS provider? Like there's my budget with the money to get these services, but I mean, the FMS isn't doing it for free. How do they get compensated? And actually, this is a recent change. The cost of the FMS provider, it used to be the case where you somehow had to make room in your budget for it. So it's like the idea was whatever funds were freed up by cutting out that middleman, the service coordinator, that was enough where you could cobble it together and pay your FMS. Not surprisingly, that was challenging and hard for families to try to figure out on their own. So so up until recently, you had to work it out with your FMS, how you're gonna get the funds out of your budget without taking away money that you needed for certain services. And up until recently, the regional center was not going to augment it just for the FMS. They weren't going to like, oh, here's a separate amount of money to pay your FMS. Well, that changed. Effective July 2022, the cost of the FMS provider is paid by the regional center outside of the individual budget. There's more information on this directive if you want to look it up, but this is a very good positive update where you now have the regional center helping to, and DDS helping to pay for the involvement of the FMS, which, as I said, is a service provider that you have to go with. I also just want to go into, and this is very brief. To be honest, I really can't go into too much detail because I myself am still learning the intricacies of these kinds of FMSs. It's just to let you guys be aware that there are technically different kinds of FMSs. That's what they mean when they say it's an FMS of your choice. It still has to be an FMS vendored with the regional center, but the FMS could be set up in different ways. Basically what level of control and how they distribute funds out of your budget. So the three models are actually listed here: bill payer, sole employer, and co-employer. And if you want a better breakdown or detailed about what the differences are, and if you're thinking like, oh, which one do I go with? Then I put the link to a chart that DDS helpfully provided that like actually compares three of them. I'm like, okay, this is the differences and how they work. But in the end, they're all going to be distributing the funds and using that to pay out your service providers. So just again, broad overview of each one. The bill payer FMS. These are goods or services purchased directly from a business. The FMS helps take the money from the budget, pays for goods and services listed in your IPP. This is where the distinction is with the other two. There's no employer-employee relationship that exists between the FMS service provider or you, the participant. If you're wondering practically what that means, unfortunately, that's information that we'll not be able to answer with too much detail. Just letting you know that's the main distinction with this bill payer model. The other one is co-employer. So in this one, you share some of the employer roles and responsibilities with an FMS. So the FMS is still required and involved with the distributing funds, but now you're kind of playing more of a say in distributing that money and helping them distribute those funds as well. That said, the FMS is still the FMS is the employer of record. The consumer, maintain the ability to hire and fire employees, but you got to do it with input with the FMS. The FMS maintains primary employer liability and required insurances, so the benefit is that they're going to handle that. The FMS also verifies provider qualifications and processes payroll. The last one is the sole employer type of FMS. And that one, you, the consumer, the actual client of the regional center, you are the direct employer listed of the service providers. The FMS, that said, FMS still involved. As I said, you have to have an FMS there. But with the sole employer, the FMS will assist you by ensuring that you follow all applicable employment laws, verifies provider qualifications, and helps process payroll. But that said, under the sole employer, there's more responsibility that falls on you. You are required to obtain necessary employment insurance, and also setting up like how workers' comp might work. So the idea is with the sole employer that you actually have more of a role with distributing the funds. but it also means that you're also having to take on more of the work of like figuring out employment insurance and stuff like that. That said, FMS still has to be involved, but they're kind of taking more of a step back as compared to the co-employer and the I'm blanking on the ones I just mentioned. Co-employer and bill payer.
Thank you, Emily. I'm still scratching my head
Oh,
about the three.
Maria, are you on mute?
No, I'm not on. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
I can hear
Hello?
you.
Can
Yes,
you
we
hear me? Oh, okay. So with what Emily had to say, if you really want to know more about the three models of FMS, I would probably talk to the regional center about it, or maybe reach out to the different FMSs that you're considering and talk to them. They may have a better idea of the nuances, especially between the last two, to decide what's best for you. So right now we're going to talk about the individual budget. So we're going to go to the next slide. Okay. So what's the individual budget? The individual budget is the amount of money that I'm going to need as a consumer to buy those services and supports that are in my IPP. And this budget will be determined by the IPP team. As a consumer, I'm part of the team, right? What I have heard is that this could be, that the first year that you're in SDP, it's a pretty rough, it's there are a lot of bumps along the way. Perhaps there's a lot of discussion about how much your budget should be, what your spending plan looks like. But what I have heard is that after that initial year, things start to get easier. So the budget, you might be thinking about, well, how do we develop, how much money is in the budget? How much am I going to get? It's based on the cost of services and supports that the regional center spent on the consumer in the last 12 months. So it's not based on the amount authorized, because the amount of services off the amount of authorized services, the value of that may be less than what the regional center spent on you in the last 12 months. So it's really important to understand that distinction. Next slide. Okay. Now, your individual budget is redetermined each year. It could go up or down depending on changing needs. Now, there could be change of circumstances that may require your budget to be increased. There may be unaddressed or unmet needs that may affect your budget. And if you don't agree on the amount of budget that's being offered, you can still appeal that. The regional center has to give you a notice of action, and you can ask for a hearing through the Office of Administrative Hearings about your budget. Now, I did want to take you to a directive. Remember those directives from DDS? I want to show you a directive about the individual budget. So this directive was issued by DDS January 11th of 2019, and it talks about the individual budget development and spending plan. But if we go down, because I know that there's a question out there about, okay, you've talked about a budget based on expenditures of the past 12 months. Well, what if I'm new to the regional center and I don't have anything to show for the last 12 months, or I I just don't, I'm a regional center client without any services in the last 12 months, and believe me, that happens. Yes, shockingly so. So if you're one of those who, you're new to the regional center system, or you haven't really spent any money in the last 12 months because you haven't gotten any services in the last 12 months, Well, the law says that your budget is going to be calculated, the annual cost of providing the needed services and supports. This is done using the average cost paid for each of the identified services and supports, and how often the IPP team determines each services and support is needed. So the average cost may be adjusted if the regional center determines the participant has unique needs that result in a higher or lower cost. Unique needs may include, but are not limited to, I always love that language because it means that these are just examples and not the only thing. So not limited to language preference, support for behavioral medical needs, and location of available services. So that's how an individual budget is determined if you don't have anything, have any expenditures in the last 12 months. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and we're going to go ahead and go to the presentation. Okay, and we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Emily.
Thanks, Maria. So I'm just going to be covering another important aspect of the self-determination program, the spending plan. And the spending plan naturally results from having an individual budget. So what is the spending plan? And what's the difference between it and your individual budget? The individual budget is the amount of money, funding you have available to pay for services and supports. The spending plan is how you will use that money to pay for services and supports. And I just want to clarify, or we really want to emphasize, you can only purchase services and supports that are approved by the federal government. There are requirements placed because the funding, it's not just the fact that it's from the regional center. There are some of these larger federal criteria on how the funding is used. So just want to be clear and set that up. And in fact, there is yet another DDS directive that goes into just like the specifics of the goods and supports you can get through the self-determination program. That said, all of the self-determination program is supposed to work as an alternative, to the traditional system, which means that the services that that many get from regional centers, respite, social recreation, other services that are provided to the traditional system, you can get them you can pay for them out of the budget as well with no issue. Now going back into the spending plan, the regional center still, basically the whole IPP team and regional center still has to approve that spending plan. And I also want to add that generic resource requirement. You have to see if you can get that same or similar service paid for by another public agency. You still have to meet that requirement. You cannot purchase the same or similar service if it is in fact available from a generic agency, aka generic resource, whether that be like the school district or your insurance or Department of Rehab. So that requirement rule still applies, even in SDP. And then this side goes into, let's say you wanted to shift things around in your spending plan. Like, the spending plan breaks down and what I use funding for what, including the amount. But I mean, how strict does it have to be? Don't I have any flexibility or some freedom in how I can use that money in my individual budget? You actually can. So the spending plan actually does allow for you to increase or decrease in certain categories where you want to put more money in. So all the services and self-determination that you're using the money from the budget for, there's 3 categories. There's living arrangement, employment and community participation, and health and safety. So any services, whether it be respite or independent living or day program, they're all going to fall into one of these categories. And you can actually shift funding up to 10% without approval from one category to another. So if you're like, you know what, this social recreation program really has been great for me or great for my child. They really are benefiting from it. I want to increase the hours, but I got to get but I have to get funding from somewhere. Can I take a little funding out of this category that I initially had slotted for like respite or this category and then increase the social rec so they can get more swimming lessons and stuff like that? You can. And you don't even have to get approval for that up to 10%. Over 10%, it can still happen, but you have to bring it up with the regional center, your IPP team, and so everyone has to agree to it. Oh yeah. So if you're still wondering, like, okay, well, this SDP, as I mentioned, more or less, I don't want to say completely cuts out the middleman, the regional center service coordinator. They still have an important role to play, but now it's you who are helping to set up this plan for yourself or your child, and not having to put it all on a service coordinator who's usually have to handle some pretty big caseloads. So the regional center service coordinator, they still can help with services setting up or helping you like identify services and supports provided through the regional center system. Um, they are part of the process of confirming the individual budget, developing the IPP, and in fact, your service coordinator can be the independent facilitator if you choose. Honestly, I don't really see the point since the benefit of the option of choosing an IF is taking that burden off the shoulders more or less of the service coordinator, but you can do it. It could also be a temporary thing. Let's say like you're just overwhelmed and an IF that you had chosen, I don't know, something happens and they're not available. You could transfer that role to the service coordinator until something is set up in its place. So that's one, option you could use if that were to happen. So this is just more resources in the event where an problem crops up. And so this is another way that you could try to get some attention to a matter, on top of the option of like appealing. If there's a straight up disagreement about the budget, there would be the fair hearing process. But if there's an issue where it's like more the implementation of the plan, where it's like, okay, there's a problem going on, it's interfering with everything. It's not necessarily because of a disagreement. It's because I'm trying to get this to work, but something's in the way. An example that I've seen is the FMS just not being on top of things on time and paying back service providers like, hey, FMS, my chosen respite worker is saying you haven't paid him yet. What's going on here? So that's an issue where it's like there's no disagreement about the funding. The issue is that the FMS is just dragging their feet and having problems for some reason. So you're thinking, well, what do I do in that kind of situation? So one way you can clear that up is raising it to the SDP ombudsperson. So there is a designated office of the SDP called the SDP ombudsperson. They work with DDS, the state agency. They're a way to resolve disputes or issues relating to SDP. They also can be brought in to possibly investigate complaints about how your SDP plan is being implemented. So I just included the link and the contact if you want to have that resource on hand if something like that were to come up. So we've pretty much reached the end of our presentation. We just wanted to finish off with a list of resources that can help you guys as you further consider and explore the self-determination program. First off is our own, Disability Rights California. We actually have a manual that really goes into the background and basics and tips with just the general regional center system. And that is broken down chapter by chapter. and all available in English and in Spanish at the following link. And we actually have tried to incorporate SDP as well. Not as much, again, more broader general info, but we do have it in our Rula now. And then there's a link to other publications. We've got a lot of pubs, not just Regional Center. We got ones for IHSS, Medi-Cal, Mental Health, Department of Rehab. So there you go. And then we got more on the next slide. And these are other resources about self-determination program. One of them is actually our sister branches to DRC, the Office of Clients' Rights. And because there's an OCRA for each regional center, so they themselves also would have resources about self-determination program. It's one of those things where it's like we all work for DRC, but technically we kind of do our own thing. Another is a great one is Disability Voices United, DVU. And they actually have weekly webinars that really go into aspects of SDP, often led by the director, Judy Mark. And they're all recorded, all available. The link is, I put the link to their postings, recordings on their webpage. They also have it on YouTube. So for example, they'll actually be like, why would you go? What's the benefit of a sole employer versus a co-employer FMS? That's the level of like discussion and detail they get into on SDP. That's really helpful for the people who are pursuing it. Another great resource is the State Council of Developmental Disabilities, SCDD. I put a link for them, and as Maria had pointed out, they actually also are a legitimate provider of orientation trainings. They are independent from the regional centers. So they're also a fantastic resource. And I believe just last Monday, they themselves did like a broad overview similar to this one on, it was on in SDP, but they also were discussing regional center disparities. And of course, there's the state agency itself, the one who is funneling money to the regional centers, including these budgets, Department of Developmental Services, DDS. That is the one where they post all of those directives, including the one that Maria share screened. They also have a great FAQ page on SDP. And they also have like they have like a separate segment on their website where they really go into like what SDP is, what the components are, developments, updates, all that stuff. And we have reached the end of our presentation. So we hope that this overview of SDP was at least really useful or helpful for you guys if you're considering it and figuring out if you want to move forward, and also a good introduction as you are gathering more detail about this whole program and whether it's worth pursuing.
I wanted to show people, so I went to the DDS website, those links that we provided you there. And this is where you could find a lot of information on SDP, orientation, program directives. So all of those directives, they're all in one place. And you can just scroll down and look to see if you find your issue there. Frequently asked questions, like Emily pointed out, about the SDP ombudsperson, about financial management services, about independent facilitators, about background checks, resources and tools, and program updates. You know, what do you want? You know, if you want to know what's going on, what's the latest and greatest, you could go there. So I just wanted to show this. So yeah, we're ready to take questions. We can go ahead and stop the presentation.
Alrighty, thank you everyone for your questions and your engagement. That concludes our training. We appreciate you spending your afternoon and evening with us. Thank you so much to Maria and Emily and Lonnie from Disability Rights, as well as our interpreters, Tony and Brenda. Thank you all for being here, and we hope you have a great evening. Thank you.